I went to Beijing in the early 2000s to study Chinese there. And as soon as I graduated, I started working in photo festivals such as Pingyao, Lianzhou. I worked for the Guangdong Museum of Art and so on. And then I met a private collector from England who asked me to collect Chinese contemporary photography for him. So I did that for many years and I built a collection for them. And one day I felt the need to actually look at other material. And I spent quite some time in flea markets and online to try and find old photos, vintage photos. That's also called vernacular photography. As I was in the process of collecting albums and boxes of old prints, I was trying to find ways to collect more things. And every time I was in flea markets, I could find albums with silver prints everywhere. Silver prints meant that these images were done with film, photographic film. But I could never find photographic film, so I started searching online to see if I could buy negatives somewhere. And instead of finding someone who was selling negatives, I found someone who actually was collecting them. But I didn't know why. So I gave him a call, and that's when I understood that this guy, called Xiao Ma, based in the 5th Road in the north of Beijing, is actually specialized in recycling trashes that contain silver nitrate. So that could be negative films, but it's mostly X-rays from hospitals and all sorts of silver nitrate infused trash. I struck a deal with him to buy the negatives by the kilo. First bag was bought in May 2009, and I bought a bag about 6 months ago. We're now in 2024. So it's been around 15 years that I am building this archive, and the content is very mostly 35 millimeters color negatives shot by everyday people in China, mostly in the 90s.
This project started in, as you say, in 2009 and has been going on for 15 years already. What do you think are the reasons or conditions for developing this project into a long-term project?
The reason why it's a long-term project is because the amount of images that I've been facing over the years kept on being bigger and bigger, you know. When I bought the first bag, I thought that it would probably only be one bag. Then the guy was calling me again and again, and it went from 50,000 images to over 1 million now. And the archive built in a very organic way. So months after months, years after years, I had to deal with a very large amount of photos. I'm a pretty obsessive and a passionate person, and I've always been very passionate about this project. So for the first years, I just kept it for myself. I waited for it to build up, because at the very beginning, it didn't really make sense, you know. It's important when you deal with found photography that you deal with a large amount of photos. Otherwise, it gets a bit intimate, a bit personal, and a bit anecdotal eventually. I've never really tried to be very efficient. It's a very slow process to actually deal with such material, and I never wanted to do it in a fast way. This being said, there's always been a team around the Silvermine project, and one very important person in that team is the person who take care of digitizing the negatives in China. So for over 10 years of time, someone was working full-time to actually digitize everything. when it comes to actually contemplate the photos and work on the book project and so on, this is something that I've done mostly by myself. But when you think about it, I mostly had to deal with 10,000 photos a month. And when that's your job, it's not a lot to deal with. So it gave me time to look at them again and again. And the more you see, the more you learn, the more ideas will actually emerge. And that's a pretty organic process. And that's the way I like to work.
Do you think the Silvermine project will ever be finished? For example, maybe one day when the mining of this negative is complete, would you call it the end of the project?
I don't think so. It's very important for me that I keep on collecting the negatives as long as the recycler contacts me. And eventually one day will stop contacting me, and I will probably be able to claim that the Beijing Silvermine project actually witnessed the death of analog photography in China. And I think that's a very coherent and important claim to have with that project. Once I'd stop collecting negatives from him, I believe that there's such a great amount of photos that it could last forever, and I hope it will last forever. You know, it's only about center of interest. It's about the angles. It's about the way you actually deal with the images and what you want to explore, what you want to say, and so on. So I believe that with the right ideas and the right people, it actually it's likely to be endless, and I hope that it will last for a very long time.
The terms of found photography and vernacular photography come out a lot when I'm reading some articles about this project, and nostalgia is also inevitably discussed when using historical images. How do you think about these specific terms or genre?
Well, the element of nostalgia is something that's really part of these type of images, right? Family photos shot in the 90s, forgotten in a drawer, they were thrown away, they arrive in a recycling plant, they're about to be destroyed, they're saved by the project, and then they see light. So there's an element of nostalgia, and that's perfectly fine with me. But it's not something I necessarily want to emphasize too much, because basically nostalgia is a position where you look at the past and you spend a lot of time looking at the past and possibly thinking that the past was a better place and a better time than the present. What actually interests me with this archival project is to actually save and adopt these images and actually try and find a place for them in the present and in the future. So it's rather a way to actually project them in the future more than to simply look at the past.
Were there any difficulties encountered during this project? And if so, how did you solve them? Or do you think they are the reason to make the project better?
Oh, I think there were many difficulties. The first one was at the very beginning of the project, when I was spending quite some time and quite some money to buy those negatives and to pay this person who was scanning the films. It was actually quite time consuming, and I didn't really know if it was worth it. When it comes to found photography, there's an interesting phenomenon, is that quantity is more important than quality. If you take each photo individually, they are not masterpieces. But if you have a very large amount of them brought together, then you start swifting from the personal memory to the collective memory. Then you can start like drawing a portrait of a place and a time. And during the first 3 years of the project, there was not enough material, there was not enough confidence to actually do something with it. And I consider giving up a few times because I thought it was maybe a waste of time and money. But eventually, at some point, I had enough photos. So I started like having anthropological themes that would show up, and it started being very interesting.
I just want to talk more about the topic of the vernacular photography because I did some research. Sometimes it's defined as amateur, but it's kind of buried between the boundary between professional and amateur. How do you think?
I would say that a way to define vernacular photography is probably images which were captured without artistic intention. I believe that it's probably the right way to define it, because it wouldn't be right to say that all vernacular photography was shot by amateur photographer. I think that professional photographer could also do vernacular photography. Vernacular photography must be anonymous. You don't know who took the picture. And it must be shot without artistic intention.
And then, although I know this question had been asked for so many times, but I'm still really curious about the Silvermine project. You are neither the person who pressed the shutter nor the person in the photo. What is the relationship between you and the photography themselves?
So, of course, I'm not the person who took the photo, and I don't know the person who appears in the photo. Talking about authorship, I'm the author of the project, and that's probably quite important to notice that individually those images probably don't mean much. They start meaning something when they're brought together, when they're part of a bigger whole, and this bigger whole is what I've tried to put together for the last 15 years. Sometimes I almost forget that they are not my images. Or to put it differently, I think they became my images. It's actually quite funny to realize that since I've been working with them for 15 years, I could look at a stack of photos, then I will bump into one that I really like, and I will remember the day I've actually seen it and find it, and I will remember the date. It will be like, oh, this is a photo I discovered in 2010. I loved it. I showed it in Hong Kong and in Sydney and in Switzerland. And it's part of my they became part of my personal story in a way. And so after years and years and dedication to the project, the lines of authorship starts blurring in an interesting way. But yeah, the act of saving, in the act of choosing, the act of recontextualizing an image is an artistic gesture. And this artistic gesture, I believe, comes with a notion of authorship.
About during the time you were working on the Silvermine project, have you ever thought about taking photographs by yourself or still focus on your work as a photo collector and editor?
No, I never considered taking photos myself. I never felt the need, and I never felt that it would bring something to the project. But never say never, you know. I might one day come with an idea or with an obsession that will require me to actually take photos. And when a photographer takes images, he should always ask himself, is it needed? Does the world need this, you know? So for now, it's not something that I did.
The digitization of images has become the mainstream in the 21st century. That means right now, most of the project and most of the pictures are digitized. But Silvermine is in opposition to it. This project has been working really hard to present its work through books and exhibitions that are material and physical in nature. Why do you think that in 2024, analog film or family albums will still be so important as a touchable medium? And what will it be still irreplaceable by digital?
On a personal point of view, I am absolutely obsessed and in love with analog photography, because I just simply find that there's something magical about it. The invention of photography, the invention of the camera, the film, this strange little object that you expose to light and shadows for just a few seconds and that can actually physically grasp an instant in time, that could be preserved so well for so many decades, and that you can scan and enlarge and redevelop later, is something that I find magical and something that I find quite poetic. Of course, the technology involved, now everybody has a camera on his smartphone. It's very convenient. Photography is changing like it always did, and that's perfectly fine with me. But I'm less sensitive to these images because of their very form. I think they probably lack the magical element, and I find them less poetical. So the physicality of the object is always very important. It's important at the very beginning of the project, when you actually deal with the negatives. It is very important with the outcomes, when the fruits of my researches and investigation actually turned into a photo book. I realized that making photo books for me is a way to archive those photos. So we're today in my studio, in my archive, everything is there. 1 million negatives, a few hundred albums, prints, books, and so on. What we call an archive is physically here. But it's a private project. Everything is here, and I don't know what's going to happen in the future. There could be an accident. We're next to the Seine River. There could be a flood. There could be a fire. Everything could be gone. But the books won't be gone. So if I spend a few years working on a collection, working on an idea, then one day it will be printed in 500 copies, 750 copies, 10,000 copies, and it will travel the world, and it will end up on shelves in Taiwan, in Russia, in United States, England, and so on. And no matter what happens to the originals, no matter what happens to the physical archive, this will survive. And I think it's a very good motivation. It's a very good reason to make photo books. It's a way to archive them and to also be able to share them in a new form for quite a reasonable amount of money. So that's why I like this object so much. I also quite like when a photo book doesn't look like a photo book too much. There's a long history with photography where photography was turned and transformed into unusual objects. And that's something I've always been very sensitive to. And when I make a photo book, I always try to challenge the form of the usual hardcover book with the first page and the last page. So as you understood, I work with found photography and not photos I took myself. So it's images that I recycle in a way. It's true for the content, and most of the time it's also true for the form of the object. To give you an example, the first book I've made is this one, 5 little colorful album. It was published by the Archive of Modern Conflict, and it was designed by a Chinese designer now based in Hangzhou, whose name is Mei Shuzhi. And as I was collecting things in flea markets, I bumped into this object, and as you can see, it's a little Laparello that was made in order to store the 12 poses of your 6x6 120 film. So you could actually look at them in transparency, you could actually take them out and use them to develop them. And I thought everything was perfect about this object. So with everyday people photography, without them even really noticing, it's actually witnessing a tremendous amount of changes in the society and on the history of the country.
As we come to the end of the interview, as a photo collector and editor, what would you like to tell young photographers, and if they are also interested in collecting images as a method to present their own work? Do you have any advice or suggestion to offer?
It's a very simple advice, I suppose, but simple is not bad. Is take a lot of time looking at your photos, but don't forget to take a lot of time looking at other photos, existing photos. Sometimes I find photographers are spending too much time looking at their own things, and they forgot to see where photography comes from, how it was used, why it was used, by whom, and looking around at everything, the most famous photographer to a photo that you can find in the trash, allows you to see things more wisely, maybe.
I see. Yeah, that's a wrap.
Thank you.